Maroon Spirit 954. This is the 10th week. Today is December 2nd, 2019. And we are walking through the Maroon Nation history and the Seminole Nation history. Tonight's Dr. Carter G. Woodson quote from The Miseducation of the Negro states the following: Negroes do not need someone to guide them to what persons of another race have developed. They must be taught to think and develop something for themselves. It is most pathetic to see Negroes begging others for a chance, as we have been doing recently. Quote, "Do not force us into starvation," unquote, we said. Let us come into your stores and factories and do a part of what you are doing to profit by our trade. The Negro as a slave developed this fatal sort of dependency and restricted mainly to menial service and drudgery during normal freedom. He has not grown out of it. Now the Negro is facing the ordeal of either learning to do for himself or to die out gradually in the breadline in the ghetto. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro. Tonight's Black Inventor, Mr. Philip B. Downing, invented the electric switch for railroads. Federal patent number 430118, June 17th, 1890. Mr. Philip B. Downing also invented the letterbox. Federal patent number 462093, October 27th, 1891. Definitions: school, any institution at which instruction is given in a particular manner. Education, an enlightening experience. American, noun, a native or citizen of the United States. Descendants, one who follows in the bloodline of an ancestor, either lineally or collaterally. Slavery, a situation in which one person has absolute power over the life, fortune, and liberty of another. Treaty, an agreement formally signed, ratified, or adhered to between two nations or sovereigns. Reparations, the act of making an amends for a wrong. Maroon historical points. Point 1. Their black skin made them easy targets to identify, so black became a badge of bondage. Point 2. Were Maroons and Black Americans escaping slavery or breaking the law? Point 3. Outlaw slave colonies were called Maroon colonies. Point 4. Maroon leaders were first and foremost military officers. Point 5. Maroons paid a small agricultural tax to be used for common defense. The 12 steps of recovery for the American descendants of slavery. Step 1. Learn about the estate or estates your family originated from. Step 2. Who established that estate? Step 3. What nation and confederacy had jurisdiction over that area prior to the European? Step 4. Ask all nonprofit organizations you attend what's your position on reparations. Step 5. They either support it or they don't. No support, no money. However, if they support it, then immediately children and adults need weekly classes free of charge about steps 1, 2, and 3, and field trips to ADOS landmarks in that city, county, and state. Step 6. Don't support European holidays for the remainder of the year. Step 7. Avoid spending money with any small business that doesn't hire your people. Step 8. All businesses need operating cash. Spend money with American black businesses. All other groups rely on our energy and operating cash to survive. Set the trends of making other groups follow our lead and support our clubs, services, products, and entertainment. Step 10. The U.S. government is bankrupt. The Federal Reserve prints money, i.e. quantitative easing. It also burns money, i.e. quantitative tightening. The U.S. dollar hasn't been backed by gold since Richard Nixon in 1971. The government operates off the full faith of its citizens to pay debt and taxes. American descendants of slavery no longer have faith in the U.S. government. This is why financial support will be altered, stopped, and redirected. Step 11. Teach your kids 1 hour a day about their history on this land. Subsection A. Have them learn about a black inventor. Subsection B. Have them know about our heroes. Subsection C. They should know the European that conquered the estate you live in. Subsection D. They should know the nation of people prior to European invasion militarily and culturally. Step 12. Practicing these steps will educate us on the land we're claiming, America, and attaches us to the history and laws of the U.S. government. Every estate American descendants of slavery live in should have steps 1, 2, and 3 advertised via social media, radio, and newspaper. This in 13 weeks, 1 fiscal quarter, will bring us together for our common defense. So the last video was about the Emancipation Proclamation, and I wasn't as measured as I would have liked to be. It's emotional because it's a document that's related to my group's history and my history personally. And so taking time to read it and realizing that we're running around claiming something that didn't really happen the way we believe it did. If it doesn't, if your emotions don't go up, then you're spiritless or you're spiritually dead. So I'm gonna try to stay measured on this one. We're gonna do a recap of the Emancipation Proclamation. Point 1 of the recap: the executive government, military, and naval recognize slaves to be forever free. So we understand reading the Emancipation Proclamation that was a military campaign and it was a military strategy. The judicial branch of the United States government didn't recognize it. The legislative branch didn't recognize it. Only the president and his warlords, or the commander-in-chief and his warlords, recognized that we were free. Point 2. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina. They were all a part of the Confederate nation. So if you live in one of those states, it's good to know that you live in an estate that historically separated itself from the Union, also known as the United States government, and they wanted to operate under a different order or a different program. Point 3, terms of freedom. Abstain from violence unless in defense. Second point, all cases allowed, labor faithfully for reasonable wages. Third point, people of suitable conditions will be received into the armed services of the United States government, also known as the Union. So we can clearly see after 100 years worth of Seminole Wars with the Maroon Nation down in Florida, them having to establish a military buffer estate by the name of Georgia, finally getting those runaways and those black Native Americans that were a part of the Seminole Nation, finally getting them agreed to move west of the Mississippi River. Once they were able to get a large percentage of those black Americans to go west of the Mississippi River, they could then hone in and focus on their prisoners of war or their slaves. And so we see maybe within a 20 to 30 year period after the Indian Removal Act, actually about a 30-year period, the Indian Removal Act was in 1830. So the Civil War pops off in 1861. So 31 years, once that Indian Removal Act was signed, the Seminole Nation and Maroon Nation, they didn't start heading west in numbers on the Trail of Tears until about 10 years later, 1840s through the 1850s. So this whole video series has been about those free American blacks. Now, at the same time, if you go back at the timeline that the first Seminole War started, understand that there were slaves running parallel, living a completely different life than those free American blacks. Whether they were part of the Seminole Nation, whether they were part of the Maroon Nation, or another nation or confederation on this land. So now we're at a point where the roads cross. You got those free black Americans crossing paths with the enslaved through the Emancipation Proclamation. Because now you have the Confederate States of America going to war with the United States of America. And so Abraham Lincoln issues an Emancipation Proclamation because he wants to use those American black slaves or prisoners of war as fodder, bodies. All right, so let's get into what happens now that Abraham Lincoln has issued his Emancipation Proclamation. And the last point on the Emancipation Proclamation, it was two separate governments. The United States government, which is what Abraham Lincoln was representing, his Emancipation Proclamation had no weight when he proclaimed it, because the Confederate States of America was a separate government. So also keep that in mind. It's two separate governments now, two separate nations, two separate entities. All right, so here we are. So the emancipation was also imposed. We understand that's a military tactic. That's a way that he can get more bodies within his military and his naval. Most Native Americans allied with the Confederacy. All right. Now, this was a great ploy tactic by the European, because remember, at the start of the Civil War, the Confederate States of America were going to those Native American nations, and they were letting them know there is no treaty. We have no agreement with you. Your treaty was with the United States government. You're in Confederate States of America territory now. You're going to have to do a new treaty. So a lot of these Native American nations ended up having to go into treaties with the Confederate States of America, because the United States of America treaty was no longer being recognized. So we're at the end of the Civil War now. So we're around 1865. The death of the Confederacy gave the United States government a new opportunity to impose its will on Native Americans. So at the end of the Civil War, the United States government was able to impose its will on Native Americans. Let's see how, based on what I just mentioned previously. Existing treaties were scrapped. So the United States government had treaties, and understand, a treaty is the highest law on the land. When you read the United States Constitution, it tells you that it will honor all treaties. So the treaties that the United States government made with other nations of Native Americans, once the Civil War starts, those Native American nations that contracted or went into treaty with the Confederate States of America at the end of the Civil War, the United States government turns around and says, well, the treaty that we had prior to this Civil War, because you went into a treaty with our enemy, that treaty doesn't exist. You see what they did? The Native Americans got tricked. Because remember, the Black Americans, which were the Seminole Nation and the Maroon Nation, we don't have a treaty. At the end of the Third Seminole War, there was no treaty signed. So the Seminole War never ended. The Third Seminole War. At the same time, the Maroon Nation was never recognized. Even though we had leaders that were in the Seminole Nation, the Maroon Nation as an independent nation of runaways from the legal construct of slavery instituted by the United States government, they never had a treaty at all. So all those agreements that Native American nations went into with the United States government, once they signed up with the Confederate States of America, and then the Confederate States of America lose the Civil War, the United States government turns around and says, we don't recognize anything that we had going on prior to 1861. Large portions of land were taken from the nations by the United States government. So now that there's a void in the treaty, and there is none, so the Confederate States of America, they lose, so that treaty doesn't exist anymore. And the United States government is saying, hey, that treaty we had, we're going to come up with new terms and come back to the negotiating table. So Native American nations took a big time loss within that whole Civil War scam. That's basically what it was. It was a way to finesse the Native Americans out of their land, use black slaves to defeat the Europeans' brotherhood, and then at the same time impose their will on the Native Americans that were already here doing business. Plains Nation, Swannies, and Delawares received it in return. All right, so now you have land being transferred within Native American nations. So Native American nations were losing their land to Plains Nation, Native Americans, Shawnees, and Delawares. Now the U.S. government and European citizens didn't allow slaves and didn't need slave hunters. All right, so at the end of the Civil War, there is no more slaves unless convicted of a crime. So you didn't need the slave hunters. Remember that we're getting paid 7 cents an hour, the slave patrol, which morphed into your police. No need for them now. We're not hunting down runaways from certain plantations. Choctaws and Chickasaws resisted up into the 1890s. All right, so those two nations of people, they were going to keep the legal construct of slavery going on within their nation way past 1865. They went on all the way into the 1890s, still operating as if the Civil War had never happened. Within each nation, American blacks face years of legal challenges and political protests to win citizenship rights, land, schooling, and equality of opportunity. That's the problem right there. Within each nation, American blacks face years of legal challenges. This is the problem for American descendants of slavery. At the end of the Civil War, a lot of American blacks went into Native American nations. Some of us stayed on plantations. Some of us ran away and I guess lived what you would call a self-employed life. Just basically, I'm going to live off the land and, you know, I'm just going to exist that way. A lot of us went to the Native American nations that were already on the land. And there were legal challenges within those nations. We have to understand that the Europeans' form of government that we know in 2019, it comes from the Native Americans that were already here. This is their form of government. Understand that very clearly. Native American nations had structure, they had armies, they had commerce, they were doing world trade. All of that was already going on. That's how you have a nation. They had a constitution, they had judicial branch, executive branch, legislative branch. They had all of that. The European just copied that form of government and they learned it while military defeating different nations on this land. Really understand that. But for the American black that descends from slavery, you went from being property, if you were on a plantation, to being freed by the Union or the United States government. You either ran away or you joined the military, right? You fought on behalf of the United States government, the same government that enslaved you. And then at the end of the Civil War, you could have went back to that plantation and labored faithfully for reasonable wages. Or you could have ran away and went to a Native American nation and lived within that nation. Or you could have went and did your own thing. But the point is, we're a nationless group of people. So if you stayed on the plantation, you were going to come up under the United States government as a United States citizen, not an American. That's why I put that as one of the definitions. The definition of American is a native, right, to the land, which we are because we've been here way before the United States government was established. Or you're a U.S. citizen. So we got put in a box of U.S. citizen. And now you look in 2019 and you wonder why immigrants and all these other fabricated classes of people get bunched in with us under citizenship. We have fallen to the lowest form as a group of people. We have fallen so far. Because we have time on this land, we should be a nation within a nation, no different than Native American nations. So let me go back. Within each nation, American blacks faced years of legal challenges. It didn't matter whether they were part of the United States government, which is a nation. It didn't matter if they were a part of the Cherokee Nation, the Choctaw Nation, the Chickasaw Nation. Everywhere we went at the end of the Civil War, we had legal challenges within those nations trying to live, and political protests to win citizenship rights. We're the outcasts. Land, schooling, and equality of opportunity. We're the outcasts. It didn't matter if your people ran to the Cherokee Nation. It didn't matter if your people ran to the Choctaw Nation, the Chickasaw Nation, the United States government. It didn't matter where we ran. We all endured the same political challenges. And even to this day, I believe that those black Americans are still having a hard time becoming a member of certain nations of Native Americans on this land. Many American blacks entered Native American nations after the Civil War. So we already just went through that. Yeah, that's basically what's happening. I'd rather go to the natives on the land than to stay on the plantation with the former slave owner. Well, what if you wasn't a former slave? What if you were part of a Native American nation that was defeated during the war and you're black? Well, I'm going to go to a Native American nation. I'm not going to do business with the European. That's my enemy. Many American blacks married and made their living in a society not so violent with race and skin color. All right. So it wasn't as violent within most of the Native American nations. Right. And so that's how we hear the stories within our bloodline that, oh, your great great grandma was Cherokee or Choctaw or Chickasaw. So a lot of that was going on. A lot of baby daddies and a lot of baby mamas even back then. Okay. Or it could have been marriages from different Native Americans, from different nations of Native Americans that all had to come together and kind of form a new nation after the Civil War. So if one of your family members were a part of that process, then consider your bloodline to be lucky. But there were a lot of us that didn't have that opportunity, so they stayed on the plantation and sharecrop. American blacks that fought in the Civil War for the Union were denied full membership among the Choctaws and Chickasaws upon return. So here's two nations of Native Americans that wouldn't give full citizenship. The Choctaws and the Chickasaws. They wouldn't do it. So this is a prime example of what I'm explaining, that it's been a fight since the first Seminole War. And I know a lot of us like to talk about the slave rebellions, you know, the Nat Turners of the world. What I'm talking about is on a bigger scale and way more organized. I'm talking about war. I'm not talking about a riot in LA or a riot in Miami. I'm talking about a war. And so what happens in our history on this land, we've only heard about the small riots, the plantation overthrows or the plantation riots. This whole video series is, the main purpose of it is to understand the last high level organization of American blacks was the Maroon Nation and the Seminole Nation. That was the last time that we were actually a nation doing trade, having a military, paying an agriculture tax for the military. That's the last time that we were governing ourselves. Everything since the end of the Civil War has been begging other nations of people to accept us instead of standing on our own square and handling our affairs as men. American blacks built their own schools, hired and paid teachers. All right, so a lot of us didn't choose to go to a Native American nation. We didn't choose to go back to the plantation and sharecrop, labor faithfully for reasonable wages. So a lot of us band together and we just did our own thing. And we built our own schools and hired and paid our own teachers. They converted homes and churches into schools. So this is why one of the steps of recovery for the American black is the church receives too much money via collection plates not to be a school for our people. I'm not against religion. Your relationship with your higher power, the supreme architect of the universe, that's personal to you. I'm speaking from a standpoint of if you have a customer base or a congregation that is giving you money, we are in last place as a group of people under the United States government in 2019. It makes no sense to not ask those leaders of the church or any black fraternity. You ask the leader, the secretary, and the treasurer. I'm sorry, you don't ask. You tell them, in order to continue to receive our money, this is what you must do. This is why I was able to come up with that, because the only way we're going to get out of this situation, you have to look back at those successful American blacks that did this. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. All we have to do is do a little homework and do a little study of our history on this land and look at what did the elders do. And it's clear. They built their own homes. They built their own schools. They paid their own teachers to teach their kids. Makes a lot of sense. And then they turned around and converted homes and churches into schools. Yeah, you're not just going to open up on Sunday or whatever day you open up. Again, it's common sense. Yeah, you're going to provide field trips for the kids. You're going to do everything that you possibly can for the next generation while we fight as adults to get everything aligned for the kids. You're also going to be pouring into the kids. We'll give you a couple of hours on one day for emotionalism, worship, praise. The rest of the week is faith without works is dead. It's time to go to work. If you have to make a sacrifice, fill schools up to educate your own people. If you have to make a sacrifice, fill schools up to educate your own people. How is the European ensured military occupation on foreign land, which is North America? This is foreign land to the European. He's only been here 245 years, people. The United States government is about 1776 to 2019. The United States government is one of the youngest nations on planet Earth. They haven't been here that long. Yeah, it started with the rulership from Europe sending over people when you got the colonies and everything set up. So that's how you get the total of 400 years. But understand, the United States government is less than 250 years old. This has not been going on for that long. But if you're going to make a sacrifice, you fill up schools to educate your own people. Common sense. So you fill up the church. We don't have any black schools. Nobody wants to donate to Dr. Umar Johnson School. Nobody wants to do it that way. Then what you do is you get all the kids and you get them in that church and you start to educate them. So clearly we can see that the blueprint has already been laid. The question is, will we do it? One of the biggest problems that we have as a group, and I just want to share this very quickly because on a personal level, I realized this about 11 years ago. When you get new information, it should change your behavior over time. And on a personal level, in order to put myself in a position where I could walk away from laboring faithfully for a reasonable wage to running my own operation, the first thing I had to do was get my personal money in order. And that was one of the hardest challenges as an American black man. Because see, once you get introduced to a balance sheet is a financial statement. You have assets, you have liabilities. When I started to recreate myself financially, I had zero assets. And I'm not talking about assets from a banking standpoint. A banker will let you count assets that are really liabilities. If you spend money on a monthly basis on something, that is an expense. Something that puts money in your pocket is an asset. So I didn't have a prudent reserve. To live under the United States government, you need a minimum of 3 months of living expenses set aside. So if your monthly expenses are $2,000 a month, you need to have $6,000 in a savings account for emergencies. I didn't have that. I didn't even have $1,000 cash. I had a Capital One credit card. I was chasing a credit score, but I had no money. And once I started understanding and increasing my financial intelligence, the hardest thing for me to do on a personal level, navigating amongst my people, was a spiritual battle. Because the majority of us see money with our eyes and not our minds. See, we'll look at somebody with a nice car, which is a liability, and we will assume they're successful. Most American blacks are walking around in society on December 3rd, 2019 with a negative net worth. You are a walking balance sheet. If you do not have an emergency fund, which is 3 months of living expenses set aside, that's the minimum. You can run it up to 6 months. You can run it up to a year. The minimum is 90 days. If you don't have that, so on the asset side, you have nothing. On the liability side, let's say you have credit card debt. You have a mortgage that you're liable for. You have a car note that you're liable for. Okay? So you could owe on your car $30,000. You can owe on your house $80,000, and you can owe in credit card liability another 10. So you're $120,000 in the red. That's your balance sheet. You're worth a negative $120,000, but you look good when you're on the streets in your car, or when you bring somebody to your neighborhood and show off your house. However, if something happened to you, you need a minimum of $140,000 life insurance just to pay off your debtors. That's not including putting you in the ground. That's not including giving something if you have kids to your kids. And so one of the biggest challenges for me personally was I had to isolate. In order to acquire wealth, I had to get away from the nigger culture. And that meant that I had to watch no more donations, no more collection plates. I'm paying myself first. There's no reason why I should be doing anything other with my money than building up my 90-day emergency fund. Once you get there, then you can start doing different things. What I'm saying is, as a group, we're going to have to do the same thing, but it's not going to be all of us, but it's going to take a small group of us to apply the same principles that we apply to our personal finance. We're going to have to apply that as a group, and it's going to have to be it's not going to be a large amount of us that's willing to do this, because some of us are just too gone. We're full flight from reality. We're not going to read any information. We don't have the emotional, mental, and spiritual discipline to sit down in order to come up. So it's going to be those radicals within our group that will push the envelope for the next generation. So if you feel a certain type of way when I read those steps of recovery, A lot of it comes from personal experience, and a lot of it comes from looking at the last winners in our history. Yeah, we've had a lot of individual winners that are always talked about. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, Elijah Muhammad. But you ever notice those are always individuals? When is the last time the group won? You got to go all the way back to the Maroon Nation in the 1800s. That's the last time that a group of us won at the highest level of organization, which is a nation. So I want to close with this as well. I want to mention 3 Native American nations so you can see the similarity, and go to their websites. The Cherokee Nation, you can Google Cherokee Nation and you can go directly to their website. And what you will notice about the Cherokee Nation, it has an executive branch, a judicial branch, a legislative branch, and a constitution. Does that sound familiar to the United States government? The Cherokee Nation is a nation of people within the United States government. They never dissolved their nation. They were able to keep the highest level of organization intact. Yes, they lost a lot of land. They lost a lot of lives. However, the one thing that they were able to do is say, you will not dissolve us to a slave state. A slave state of people are a people who are not organized at the highest level as a group. And the highest level of organization as a group of people is nationhood. Let's go to the Choctaw Nation. And by the way, the Cherokee Nation's website is cherokee.org. So all my highly schooled, uneducated Negroes, this is a slap in the face to all of us because we're born into this by default. We are a part of a group that has been dissolved from nationhood. Let's look at the Choctaw Nation. It has an executive branch, a judicial branch, and a tribal council, and a constitution. So the Choctaw Nation is operating as a group on the highest level of order on planet Earth. Let's look at the Chickasaw Nation. The Chickasaw Nation has a governor, a justice division, a legislative department, and a constitution. We've got a lot of highly schooled Negroes. Everybody is not going to be a part of the same nation. That's why there were so many nations in North America when the European came to what they considered to be the New World. Wow, you got different groups of people governing themselves under different law. Where we come from is one person rulership. So yes, this was new to them. But we have to start with the First Nation. We have to understand that we are at the lowest frequency of organization as a group of people, and we all are in the bowl. It doesn't matter about my personal accolades, how I've been able to retransform myself. It doesn't matter about any other American blacks' personal accolades about wealth that they've accumulated or money that they generate. As a group of people, we are the lowest. We're the lowest frequency as a group. We operate on the lowest frequency. The highest frequency is nationhood. You have a constitution, which your group of people abide by, and you have organization and structure. You can penalize your own people through your own judicial branch. You govern and create commerce laws through your legislative branch, and you also have a spokesperson for a period of time called the governor or president who comes out of the executive branch. We don't have that. We got a large faction of us that run around and party. We got a large faction of us that run around and pray and do a whole lot of worshiping. But when it comes to organization and handling the business and the tradition and the heritage and the economics of our group of people, we have been nationless for hundreds of years. Shout out to Dr. William Katz, Dr. Barashango, Dr. Claude Anderson, Professor Black Truth, Dr. Umar Johnson, Taj Tariq Bey, Jordan Maxwell, Manly P. Hall, Gene Keating, Yusuf L, High Frequency Radio. We've got a lot of work to do. And as these videos are laid out, what did you do for Halloween? We've had 3 European holidays. We've had Christopher Columbus Day in the last fiscal quarter of the year. We've had Halloween, and now we've had Dr. Carter G. Woodson Day, which is also known to the masses as Thanksgiving. But what did you do? You're working on 90 days. Have your kids looked up 90 inventors? Have they looked up 60 inventors? Maybe it's just taking them on a tour on your off day, whenever your off day is. Maybe it's taking them out of school one day and taking them to American Descendants of Slavery landmarks, taking them to American Black museums. You know, what have you done in these last 3 months of the 400th year milestone? Have you done something to give your kid an enlightening experience, to educate your kid? Have you done something, or has it just been the same old, same old? And if it's been the same old, then it is what it is. You can't blame nobody but yourself. You cannot blame anybody but yourself. And as a group, we can't blame any other group for basic things that we must do. And one of the first things that we must do is these brick and mortar buildings that a lot of us pour money into for worship and praise. It's time for them to start using those buildings to educate our kids. We have a lot of different institutions and organizations eating off our energy that aren't putting anything substantive and long-term back. Feeding the homeless, feeding elderly. Those are heroic campaigns. We're talking about depth and weight, and we're talking about things that our ancestors have done. All we have to do is look at the Cherokee Nation, look at the Choctaw Nation, look at the Chickasaw Nation, look at the United States government nation. They make sure they train their kids about George Washington and all their different people that they need to know. The only group of people that won't isolate and focus on themselves is us. So we got to break the nigga culture. We have to break the nigga culture and be unapologetic about it. It's about just being real. The only people lying and playing games is us. With that being said, we are the gods.